Thank you. Thanks for having us. As Angie just said, my name is Carrie Jones, and I'm Managing Director at JPA Health Communications, which is a PR firm dedicated to helping pharmaceutical companies and also healthcare nonprofits reach their key stakeholders. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit with you about the FDA today. And joining me is...
My name is Talina Cook. I'm not a scientist or a medical professional at all. I'm a daughter, and my mother had pulmonary fibrosis. So I have since become a pulmonary fibrosis advocate and an ambassador for the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation.
Thank you. So before we get started, I'd love to get a sense of the people here in the room. How many of you are with industry or with industry-related companies? A few, okay. And how many of you are patients or patient advocates? Okay, great. We're gonna talk a little bit from both perspectives and take it from there. So we've had a fair amount of conversation so far about the FDA. How many of you have been in different tracks talking about the FDA? Sorry to ask so many questions, but you know what? Rule number one is know your audience. I'm trying to get a sense of what we're dealing with here. So we heard from Dr. Rowe's presentation this morning about the FDA's quest and real mission to be more patient-centered, and we're going to delve a little bit deeper into that today. We're also going to talk about some vehicles for how patient advocacy organizations and patient advocates can speak up, and then we'll walk through two case studies, one from my team and one from Talina. Okay, so everybody in the room has heard that pharmaceutical companies to come to bring a drug to market, it takes about 12 years and averages about $350 million. And what's interesting to take a look at is the only time they take that, historically, that patient voice into perspective is very late in the clinical or in the approval process. You see this little star I have at the bottom, that's right after the NDA is submitted. That's when the FDA historically has started to pay attention to that. So we're gonna talk a little bit about how that's shifting. And exactly how we can play a role in making sure that we're being heard at different milestones. So how many of you have had a chance to, either through industry or through patient advocacy, speak or engage with some element of the FDA? Okay, good experience, not good experience, roughly? Yeah?
Come to a meeting where we're preparing for our November presentation to them, and they were wonderful, and they actually stood up and talked about what a great job had been done and how much they learned about it, and it was a really positive experience. Shocking to me.
Good. Anyone else? Yeah.
Also, a positive experience with getting the FDA to help an investigator do an investigator-initiated IND application. We'd never done it before, just as we heard from one of the sessions, and they were just phenomenal in getting us going on it.
So, you know, the FDA has been under a mandate to make sure that patient voices and the patient perspective are being heard. And, you know, we're also seeing the pharmaceutical companies, by presence of the people here in the room, be more focused on that patient advocacy, that patient perspective. Is it a coincidence that the two are happening at the same time? Probably not, but it's certainly for everyone's benefit. So in 2012, that's when things started to change. But going back even further, in 1992, that's when PDUFA had the Prescription Drug User Access Fee, said that there's two kinds of regulatory review processes. The first is the standard review, and then the second was a priority review. So a priority review means that the FDA has 6 months once you submit that application to review and either approve or not approve the product. But since that time, there's been a ton of focus on how they can speed up the process. And trust me, Congress has been watching and really forcing the FDA to be responsible and accountable for helping speed new treatments. So that's when we enter in these three others. So we have the priority review, which is 6 months, and then we have fast track, breakthrough therapies, and accelerated approvals. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one, but a little more detail around the fast track and the breakthrough therapy. So the fast track, this is where it's focused, it's a rolling submission. So that's a little bit of a different, the pharma company doesn't have to have this perfect package that they delivered to the FDA for a review. They can send things along a little bit, piece at a time. But the pharma company has to opt in for this. They have to request this particular designation. Then the breakthrough therapy, this came around just a couple years ago. It's relatively recent. And here, both the pharma company can request the breakthrough therapy designation, but the FDA can also say, hey, this is really interesting. This is going to fill a gap. I think we should work with you for a rolling submission. And then the last is an accelerated approval, which moves you down from that 12-month to just 10. And in that case, it's based on a surrogate endpoint, which means that the original clinical endpoint that was identified in the trial can be modified, because maybe it didn't hit those key endpoints, but it did something else significant. So far, so good? Okay. So in talking about fast track, and the reason I called out the fast track and the breakthrough is because there's real opportunities for patient advocates to influence, persuade, have their voice heard with these two different designations. So again, fast track has to be requested by the pharma company. The FDA then has 60 days to consider whether or not that they're going to give it this designation. During that 60 days, there is an opportunity for you to say, hey, this is really important. I sat in a session earlier where they were talking about if a drug, if it didn't become approved or if a trial didn't move forward, that meant ultimately some people would no longer be eligible and potentially even die. So this 60-day period is really important. Also, you can determine whether they're looking to say, is this condition serious? And that's completely a matter of their judgment. So when they're trying to figure out, gosh, do the side effects really matter that much? Are the symptoms that the patient is going through, is it really that big of a deal? They don't know. They have no context around that. They know what they've read, but they don't really understand the impact. So by including patient testimonials in that submission package from the pharmaceutical company to the FDA, you really can contextualize that for them. Now, not every single pharma company knows that you can include the patient voice in the package. Certainly some do. Some are really savvy. Some are looking for every single edge they can to help bring their drugs to market. But I think as advocates, it's good to know that that's an option. Am I talking too fast? I mean, I could talk the bark off a tree. Just okay. Then we have breakthrough therapies. So in this case, as I mentioned, both the pharma company can request this designation, and the FDA can say, hey, this is really exciting stuff. Let's work with you on it. Now, what's different with the breakthrough designation is the FDA then commits their most senior reviewers. So you're getting the best of the best at the FDA, and that's one of the things that's a little bit different than some of the other designations. And here, they're looking for a clinically significant endpoint that, one, either has something to, reverses the morbidity and mortality, or it has an effect on symptoms. Now, when it comes to rare diseases, so often we don't have cures, but if we can move them from a terminal disease to a chronic disease, or a disease from where you can't get out of bed to where you can function again, it's really exciting stuff. And that's the kind of endpoints that they're looking for here. So there's a real opportunity for us as patient advocates to partner with drug companies to help them understand the symptoms or side effects of current therapies. Because we might be getting just enough, but the symptoms and side effects are so severe that there is a major need in the marketplace for new drugs. Yeah? That's a really good question. The answer is 3 words: matter of judgment. And one thing we've heard from the FDA, or groups like Faster Cures and Friends of Cancer Research have been saying to the FDA over and over again is, we need some clarity. Help us figure out how you make these decisions. And I wish I could say, yes, go to page 22 or this portion of the website. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, which is why we can't take ourselves out of the game and out of the fight until we try. Okay. This cartoon says, it's a mock of an FDA advisory committee meeting. And it says, patients interested in the patient experience. And then in the back, you say, what are all these people doing here? You can only get in if you pay the registration fee of $3,000. But I'm a patient, I'm a caregiver. And those groups, the suits are all up front, and they're the only ones being heard. I think that felt true for a really, really long time, but I don't think it's true anymore. And the good news is it's continuing to change. In 2010, PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, was implemented. Shortly after that, in 2012, FDIA, which is the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, came and really worked on, it has a mandate of soliciting patient views and perspectives. So if they're not hearing from you, they will actually go and seek you out because they're not doing their job and they're not meeting their goals at the end of the year if the patient voice isn't captured. So this cartoon is extinct. Isn't that a good thing? Okay, so there's a couple different vehicles that the FDA has created to help fulfill this mandate. The first is the patient network. Think of this as the FDA's concierge office for patient advocates. They have a whole department with staff dedicated to help tell patients, patient advocacy organizations, and even medical providers how they can work with the agency. That's their job. If they don't answer your calls, if they don't help you, they're not doing their job. And I think that's really exciting. And they have newsletters, they have some resources on their website. I'd be happy to share with Global Genes the one page on their website where you can access this. But if you type in FDA Patient Network, it'll bring you right to their resource page. Then there's the patient representative. How many of you have been an FDA patient representative? No? I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but in a headline, it's your opportunity to be a voice and actually have a vote at the FDA committee meetings, should there be an AdCom. And then there's CDER's PFDD. We heard about it in this morning's session. We've heard about it a couple times. I'm going to talk and add a little color about what this is. The long and the short of it is, as part of that FDIA legislation, they're required to have up to 20 meetings where they have conversations with patients and patient organizations. 20 in a world of how many chronic and rare diseases? Is that cutting it? Probably not. But it's a step in the right direction. We'll give credit where credit's due. Okay, so let's talk about a patient representative. In this case, you apply. You submit an application, it's very short, it's online, and if you are selected, you get to serve on the AdCom committee with an equal vote to the clinician or the researcher, and you get to see the submission package from the pharmaceutical company. It's kind of a big deal. It's absolutely extremely powerful. You also get to have private discussions with the FDA, and you get to present at different FDA meetings and workshops if they're happening. The catch is, not every drug goes to an AdCom. So just because you want it doesn't mean that's possible. Secondly, there is some exclusion criteria. One is conflict of interest. They want to make sure that if you have been engaged or accepted money from the sponsor of the trial or the pharmaceutical company, you may not be eligible for that position. The little poster I have on the slide here that says we're currently looking for patient advocates, I pulled this directly from the FDA's website. It looks exactly like that. So as of yesterday, they were actively recruiting patient representatives in these therapeutic areas. So it doesn't hurt to be continuously checking and looking for opportunities. Even if they're not recruiting, you can still contact them and start, it might be 2 or 3 years down the road, but start having a relationship with that CDER office and asking them if you can serve as a patient representative even in an ad hoc basis. Yes? So for a patient representative, you have to be a patient or caregiver affected by the disease. They typically do not bring in a professional patient advocacy organization leader. Now, if you run a nonprofit and you have a personal connection to the disease, you still are eligible. But if you are an operationalizing person who is brought in to lead a nonprofit, think of the CEO of the American Diabetes Association, you would not be eligible as a patient representative. Absolutely. Yep. I think it's important to note that this is a paid position too. They will pay, the FDA actually has money in their budget where it's not a lot. They pay hourly for compensation for time spent reviewing and participating in these meetings. And if you live more than 50 miles from Silver Springs, Maryland, which I'm guessing most of you do, they pay for travel as well. Okay. So that was the patient representative. There's also this patient-focused, the patient-focused drug development position. And this is, again, the 20 meetings that take place where they want to have little mini forums on different diseases where they're hearing lots of different perspectives from patients, caregivers, and also industry. But what happens if your disease is not one of those 20 public meetings that are taking place? That's what this graphic is all about. And the FDA said, ooh, gosh, we're under this mandate. We only have a budget and resources for 20 meetings, but a lot of organizations, a lot of patients have said that they want to be involved. And so they created a roadmap for external PFDD meetings. In a nutshell, you get together with other patients or patient groups. You draft a letter of intent saying, we are going to do this. You send it into the FDA, and then you host your own meeting within 20 minutes of Silver Spring, Maryland's FDA office, and you invite them to attend as a guest. The catch is, you have to pay for it. There's no resources, but ultimately, your messages are being heard by the FDA in the same way as if they were sponsoring it themselves. Any questions? Okay, I'll keep going. And then there's the FDA Advisory Committee meetings. So let's say you're a patient representative and you're at the AdCom. You get to see all the data, you get to read all the reports, you get to hear the speakers, and you get to vote. But what happens if you were not chosen or that position was already filled by the time you became aware? You can still have your voice heard. And there's a couple different ways to do that. And I think the most practical is submit a letter, submit testimony in advance. You can, even if you haven't submitted something in advance, just show up to the public AdCom. Just show up and make yourself heard. You can also write letters. There's lots of different techniques for making sure that the people who are leading that meeting can hear your voice. So I'm going to do one case study, and then I'll turn it over to Talina. So how many of you have heard of a company named Chelsea Therapeutics? A couple. So Chelsea Therapeutics was a small pharmaceutical company. It helped get this particular drug approved and then was acquired and no longer exists. And I do have permission to share this case study with you. They had a lot of mistakes in their drug approval quest. So it's a drug for neurogenic orthostatic hypotension. And for those of you in the room who don't really understand that disease, anybody who sits up too fast passes out. Sometimes they can't even sit up. They're literally at an incline all the time. There was a mediocre drug that basically kept them alive, but had very, very bad quality of life. So Chelsea Therapeutics had a drug which was approved and available in Japan, and they did their clinical trials, and the endpoints were never met. The trial design was, I think, less than desirable. We'll go with that. And they had an advisory committee meeting in which the committee members voted no to approve. So they went back, they did more clinical trial work, they modified the design to the best of their ability at that point, and then they were facing another advisory committee. And they were really not optimistic that the drug would be approved. That being said, the company, this small company based in North Carolina, was incredibly passionate because they knew and saw firsthand the results that this therapy had for their patients. And so because it was a rare community, there were not a lot of organizations available to influence and drive, and they didn't even know how to move forward with reaching and engaging with the FDA. So Chelsea brought in our agency, and we did a webinar, basically a training webinar for a few of the nonprofit groups that existed, and helped educate them on the process. And ultimately, and I'll talk a little bit more of the tactics that we used in just a moment, but ultimately they did attend and testify at the AdCom, and the committee voted 16-1 to approve, and they stood up one after another saying, the reason I'm voting yes is because of what I heard from the patients today. The clinical data still didn't do it for them, but the patient voice did. So tactically speaking, there's two things that we did. One is we sent out information to the patient community saying, the FDA is having their AdCom, and we need to hear your stories. But don't send them to us, send them directly to Christina at the FDA. And she got about 400 letters from caregivers and patients. Again, rare, but sometimes one patient had 3 or 4 people writing on their behalf. It was very powerful. The second thing we did for the advocate leaders, per se, not patients themselves, is we had a webinar where we had them sign confidentiality agreements, but we walked them through the clinical data so that they would be prepared and understand what the challenges for the FDA approval could be. And then, as a result of that webinar, they said, hey, can you help me write something? Can you help me submit a testimony? And by having that proactive reach, we were able to react and provide some guidance to the patient advocacy organizations. So we had a webinar where we walked through the data, where we walked through exactly how they can engage directly with the FDA, and then we made ourselves available to them. Okay, not every pharma company is willing to do that. It has to do with their own SOPs for compliance, but it is technically compliant.
The same strategy work for if you're filing for a grant under the Orphan Drug Act, where you have patients write in and say, please approve this grant, this is a wonderful drug, or something like that?
I don't know, but I can find out. I really don't know. Yeah.
FDA, Huntington's disease, and I think, was it Alzheimer's or Parkinson's? Parkinson's. And so I know we just bombarded them with emails and letters and everything. So I know that we're the lucky one of the 20, I guess, this year. So.
Great. Okay. So I'll pause there, and we'll take time for questions in a little bit. But Talina, would you like to share your study?
So. Sorry, I don't have slides. I was a late ad. So what happened with me, just briefly, my mom was diagnosed in 2003 with pulmonary fibrosis. And at the time of her diagnosis, we had no idea what it was. So we kind of spent the next, number of years learning. And at the time of her diagnosis, there was absolutely no treatment for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which was the form she was diagnosed with. And there was no cure. 12 years later, there's still no cure. There are a couple of treatments. And so I'm just going to kind of give you a quick little background here. When she was diagnosed very late stage, and she was given 2 years to live at best. And she actually lived 6 years. So over the course of that 6 years, we did everything possible. She was a patient, I was a caregiver, and I also became amateur researcher. So trying to learn about this disease. For those of you who are unfamiliar, pulmonary fibrosis is a disease where the lungs start scarring, and it just doesn't stop. The scarring becomes progressive, and the lung tissue basically becomes fibrotic, turns to like a stone-like substance. The lungs don't do the gas exchange anymore, so your body has too much carbon dioxide, not enough oxygen. One of the big keys as treatment, if you want to call it that for a patient, is supplemental oxygen therapy. So hooked up to a tube, hooked up to an oxygen tank, and that is how you live. In 2009, my mom passed away. And I decided that I was going to be a PF advocate. I was going to try to be that voice, not only for my mother, but for other people who didn't have the ability to speak for themselves. So I had joined a support group not long before my mom passed away, and I continued, in that endeavor. And so I've had an opportunity now over the years to spend a lot of time talking with patients and caregivers, and with medical professionals as well. So it's been very educational. In 2014, in fact, a year and 2 days ago, I actually got the opportunity to speak at the FDA on one of the patient-focused drug development panels. So I had heard about the hearing. They were doing a public hearing on IPF, and I had no idea, at the time, my first thought was there's no way they're going to ask me to speak. Who am I? I'm just a daughter. So, but I got online, and I filled out the form online, and I was contacted by email from one of the representatives at the FDA, and she said, so if you were chosen to speak, here are the 2 topics of discussion, and under each topic there were various different questions. And so she said, please answer all of these questions based on how you would answer them if you actually came and spoke. So I did that. I took the time, I sat down, wrote out what my answers would be, and I was answering really on behalf of my mother because the questions were more patient-centered. Topic number 1 was about how PF affects your life, and topic number 2 was drug therapies that are available and other medical therapies to get you through your day. So because Mom and I were very close in her journey, I felt like I was able to adequately answer those questions for her. So that's what I did. It wasn't very long after I submitted that I received an email back that said that they would like me to come speak, and I was shocked. They told me that I would be speaking on topic number 2, which was the drug therapies. So I, set up my trip, prepared to go. I did have to pay for my own travel because it was the PFDD. It wasn't it wasn't the patient representative. Darn, wish I'd have known about that. So I traveled to Washington, D.C., and my preparation was actually very easy because most of my work was already done in answering those questions. I knew what I was going to do there. I had no idea what to expect as far as what the panel was like. And when I got there, basically it was very much like, any other government hearing that you see on TV where, the panelists are sitting there at a table and they're asking us questions. And, we had that opportunity to answer the question that we were giving, but there was also a lot of back and forth. They had other questions prepared for us while we were there, so we had the opportunity to talk about that. They had people calling in, which was wonderful. The person actually running the hearings herself, there was a lot of interaction between the panelists and the FDA at that point. So I felt like, it was very empowering. And as a caregiver and an advocate for patients and families, I felt like my voice really mattered. And I felt like they were really listening, and that the voices of everybody who was there and everybody who was calling in on the phone really mattered to them. At the end of the hearing, one of the doctors from the FDA, who happened to be a pulmonologist, she summed up the day for us. And what she told us made me realize that she really heard us. And that was something that, coming from the PF community, many people often feel that they're not really heard or understood, not even by medical professionals. So we were all very happy to feel that she really heard what we were saying. She told us that what she heard was that IPF was a disease that left those affected with little or no hope. And that's true when you're dealing with a disease that is 100% fatal. She heard that the disease was a disease with no treatment and no cure, that it was largely unknown, and that even the trained medical community did not know how to deal with it. She also heard a lot about what a patient's quality of life with pulmonary fibrosis was like, and carrying around an oxygen tank all the time, being hooked up to a tube, being dependent on that oxygen is crazy. Many patients have a cough, and what she told us is, she goes, I've heard from you that when you start coughing, you're embarrassed. You don't want to be out in public. You want to stay at home. You don't want to interact. So she really got the whole quality of life issue with pulmonary fibrosis. And quality of life, when you're dealing with a disease with no treatment and no cure, all you have left is quality of life. So that was a biggie for us. She also heard that patients and families want to have a bigger and an earlier say in drug development. So don't wait until the drug trials are over and the drug is, the approval process is being requested. Patients and families want to have that say early on, definitely. In the case of pulmonary fibrosis, there were 2 drugs already in the pipeline for approval, and those 2 drugs have since been approved. They are drugs designed to slow the progression of the disease. They're not a drug that's going to give a cure. They're basically a drug to give an extension of life. And we didn't really know coming out of the FDA process if we made an impact on that particular drug decision at the time. So I contacted the woman that I'd been dealing with over email with the FDA to ask her. And what she told me was those 2 drugs had actually already been approved before we went into the hearings, but they couldn't make it public yet. It wasn't ready to be made public. But what she said is she didn't want us to feel like we were there just, kind of as a media thing. She wanted us to know that our voice really mattered. So she talked with some of the others at the FDA and wrote me back, and it was amazing what she wrote back. She told us, she told me, which I passed on to everybody else, that the hearings were a valuable learning experience for them, and that that information will inform future drug development, which is what we need because we are not done. We need a cure for this disease. They felt that our hearing reinforced the decision that had already been made to approve these drugs, and that the hearings helped them to see where the future of IPF clinical development might lie. And lastly, they hoped that the pharmaceutical representatives in attendance were also impacted by our testimony because the FDA would be willing to work with them to develop patient-reported outcome measures to gauge the efficacy of new IPF drugs and to make sure that these drugs are actually doing what they need to do and helping these patients. To have them actually say that meant a lot to me and to a lot of others in the pulmonary fibrosis community because, we wanted to make sure that our voices really were heard. I would encourage anyone to go look for either the patient representative or the patient-focused drug development panels for your disease. And like Carrie said, if your disease isn't listed there, request it. Do everything you can to make your voice heard, literally, because if you don't, you're one step further away from a cure. And in the end, when you look at all of these diseases, especially when I sit here and listen, this is the first time I've been to this particular summit, when I sit here and listen over the last 2 days to everything, there's so much about quality of life that is so important, and there's so much that we, as advocates, as patients and as caregivers and families, there's so much that we know about the day-to-day life of what happens with these patients that the pharmaceutical companies don't know, the researchers and our doctors, they don't know because they don't live with us every day. So they don't see these diseases in action the way we do. So your voice is extremely important. It is probably more important than your doctor's voice at this point. So my thing is just, to tell you all to make your voice heard.
Thank you very much. I was curious if this approach of applying for patient representative is just for products or drugs that are on the shelf to be or scheduled in the pipeline to come out for a drug, or what do you do when you have a disease that there isn't any drug yet? Is that something you can request? Yeah, so the patient representative vehicle as it exists now is for when a drug is in clinical development. The patient-focused drug development, it is unrelated to that. In fact, we're seeing some of the 20 workshops be in disease states that there is no treatment for.
Hi, my name is Francis Kalush, and I would recommend everybody to go to the FDA website and look for patient-focused drug development meetings. And for each of the meetings that they were already held, you have all the transcript, you have in the format of a webinar, and also you have like a summary of the patient voice, because during those meetings, besides all the testimony of the patients, there are polling questions about symptoms and about treatments, and all the information is on the website. And also on the same website, what you have is the meetings that they will happen. Some of those are already a date, and others they will really happen in the next 2 years. And there are some negotiations with Congress about maybe having more of those meetings follow up, but up to now there are going to be 20. And then if those negotiations, what we call the Prescription Drug Authorization Act, there might be others. So it's an opportunity for you to write to the FDA and ask for those meetings for the disease of your loved ones to happen.
The only thing I would add to that is don't forget about the FDA's patient network, that concierge as well, which can help you in navigating that process.
So I'm part of the FDA, and there is a new group that it's the Professional Affairs and Stakeholder Engagement Group as part of the Center for Drugs. So the center felt the need that we needed to have a non-regulatory group to talk and listen to the patient voice and engage the patients during the drug approval process. So if you go and look for that information, also you are going to be finding additional activities. Okay.
There was also one other thing that I want to add to that. So for the PFDDs, after the hearing was done, they actually left the docket open for quite a number of months. And they did that so the people who could not be at the hearings could add their comments as well, and their voice was also heard. So it's very important to go continue to check and see, see what is out there. If a docket is open and it happens to be on your disease, send in your comments.
Somebody else.
Just a quick comment. Through the magic of cell phones, I texted my boss and said, we need a patient representative with the FDA, and she said, oh, I already tried to be one. The only positions available right now are for devices. So I don't know if you have a limited number that you're able to fill, number of spots, but she's made the effort, and that was the response she had.
The only thing I can say is for each advisory committee, there is usually only one designated patient representative. So if the upcoming AdCom has that position already filled, then you need to look at those other ways of submitting testimony, of attending the AdCom as a public citizen, and also writing letters as a way of reaching those with a voting voice.
Isn't the patient representative term limited? Don't they swap them out?
So I think they're associated, correct me if I'm wrong if somebody has information, but I think they're associated with a particular advisory committee,
Okay.
not necessarily with the disease state or a therapeutic area.
Thanks.
I have a couple questions. There's only one FDA-approved drug for the disease that I'm here for, and we're constantly having issues with the patients being able to get it, not because it isn't available, but because they came out with a generic, but the generic one is processed differently, and these patients are very sensitive to things. They go into anaphylaxis very easily. So they need if they do have a reaction to it, they need the brand one. So it's a real hellish nightmare, actually. And then it's constantly getting sold to another company. So then it goes off the market because they have to change the NDC number. And it's just really frustrating. And then you have insurance companies not wanting to let you get it because they're unfamiliar with it, and it's expensive. And so the fight is like, I mean, just myself personally, every month, the pre-approval and everything, by the time you even get anywhere to get the pre-authorization for it, if you're in that situation, you're going months without the medication. And that's very difficult and with that particular medication. And then my daughter also was in a study for a medication to approve it for her condition, for use with her condition along with other conditions. And then they changed the formula of it, and she was no longer able to take it. And a lot of the patients weren't able to take it, but because of that study, it got labeled as under her condition. How do you go about contacting people and talking to them to change these things or to get help with that?
Don't you feel like sometimes as advocates, our job is a detective and we're chasing
Oh,
one
yeah.
problem after another? I'd be happy to talk with you offline, but
Okay.
specific to the FDA, there is an office or division within the FDA which is focused on drug shortages and
Yes.
making sure that there's a continual supply. And I would probably start there
Okay.
as part of that issue. I think there's a few other things that we can talk about as avenues of tapping into.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I hear of studies that are going on in Europe and not here in the U.S. Is the FDA going to make it any easier for these companies to bring these trials to the USA in order to have trials here?
So the FDA is sometimes involved in helping with the clinical trial protocol that's designed. But what I can say is the FDA does acknowledge and read and value the ex-US study trials. So just because a trial was done in another country or in another market does not mean that those results wouldn't be applicable to the FDA's review. Well, thank you, everyone. It was really, we'll be around if you have any questions, but thank you for your time.